When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer: what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's finish up martial melee weapons by examining the weirdest weapon option in the game: the whip. The whip is a blunt weapon used to create a loud cracking sound or inflict pain. It's hard to trace the whip back to any single point in history, but was common in any culture that domesticated herd animals. Whether herding cattle in Africa to driving sled dogs in Canada, the whip was used to either guide creatures in a certain direction or inflict punishment.
Rest! Rest!
There's actually many types of whips, each with their own unique design and application. In his book, Whips and Whipmaking, whipmaker David Morgan divides whips into two main families: the Mongol whip and the English whip. However, the decision to name these whips after ethnic groups isn't accurate to any historical usage or design from Mongolian or English regions. The blog Mach 1 Whip Artistry by Daniel Trout takes these base categories and rephrases them in terms of how they were applied, with striking whips, supersonic whips, and a hybrid category that mixes both applications. The earliest type of whips developed were the striking whips, and were most prevalent throughout history. These whips would be used to strike a creature directly, and had both loose whips like the cat o' nine tails, and semi-rigid whips like the riding crop. Loose whips were often made from leather or rope, and sometimes had lead or metal hooks braided into the lashes to cause more pain or damage. These would mainly be used for corporal punishment in the armed forces, as well as certain BDSM practices. Semi-rigid whips, on the other hand, were straighter than loose whips, springing back to their form to add more power to their strike. Riding crops of this design would be used as negative reinforcement in horse riding, applying light pressure to the horse to correct behavior. This design was also commonly used for corporal punishment in European and colonial American schools, as well as for punishment of slaves in the antebellum South. These semi-rigid striking whips are referred to as a switch, and were often made out of willow or hickory wood. The second category of whip put forward by Daniel Trout are the supersonic whips, named for the cracking sound they make when used. While they've been in use for at least 3,000 years, it was only proven as recently as 1958 that it's the tip of the whip that breaks the sound barrier, causing the loud cracking noise. This loud crack was innovative in herding domesticated animals like cattle or dogs. Outside of the ethical concerns of striking whips, the damage they did would also harm an animal's hide and meat, cutting into a farmer's profits. With supersonic whips, animals would instinctively flinch away from the loud crack, and could be used to drive entire groups of animals without actually having to hit them. These whips were commonly used by cowboys and cattle ranchers to drive herds in a specific direction, and are likely the most famous type of whip depicted in media. As widely used as they were across history, whips were also widely portrayed in media and pop culture as well. Sherlock Holmes, for example, occasionally carried a loaded hunting crop as a weapon, weighted with heavy metal to provide more heft. Whips were also used in popular films of the 20th and 21st century, from Zorro to Indiana Jones to Catwoman. These whips are often widely exaggerated in their use and effectiveness, but remain iconic as niche weapons used by exotic heroes and villains. Today, the whip is featured in many games as well, appearing in the Castlevania series, the Dark Souls series, and Dungeons & Dragons. In D&D, the whip is described as a type of exotic, one-handed melee weapon. Measuring up to 6 meters long when stretched out, whips are made of flexible, braided cords which taper closer to the tip. Added to the game in 2nd edition, the whips of older editions cost between 1 silver and 10 gold pieces, weighed 0.9 kilograms, and dealt either 1, 1d2, 1d3, or 1d4 slashing damage, depending on the edition. In 5th edition, the whip costs 2 gold pieces, weighs 1.3 kilograms, deals 1d4 slashing damage, and has the finesse and reach weapon properties. Definitely one of the most unique weapon options in D&D, the whip occupies a weird position in the game. At a glance, it seems almost useless, as its measly 1d4 slashing damage puts it among the lowest damaging melee weapons in the game. Its real trick is in its properties, as it's the only finesse weapon that has the reach weapon property, allowing dexterity-based users to add 5 feet to their melee attacks. On top of that, it's a reach weapon that does not have the heavy weapon property, meaning small races can use the whip's reach without worrying about disadvantage. For characters that have proficiency with other martial weapons, this may not seem that attractive, but it can be used creatively for character building. The idea that would jump to my mind would be to use this on a rogue, as finesse allows them to use their sneak attack bonus on top of the 1d4 slashing damage. However, rogues can't get whip proficiency as part of their class or subclass options, requiring characters to multi-class or take the Weapon Master feat in order to use the whip properly. That leaves just one other option: the way of the Kensei monk. A monk could use the whip as their Kensei weapon, granting proficiency with it and unlocking further abilities to use with it. So, if you're intent on playing a goblin Kensei monk who uses a whip as their main weapon, it'll offer you some nice benefits. For all the other characters that aren't this specific build though, you'll likely have better finesse or reach options available. As I said before, the whip is in a weird place in 5th edition. To me, it seems like the designers tried to give the whip a role in the game to make up for its lack of damage, but they really missed the mark in terms of execution. So, the whip doesn't quite cut it as a good weapon option in D&D. It seems obvious to me that any player who chooses the whip for their character is actively hindering their combat effectiveness, forcing them to choose between being useful mechanically or being creative. Rather than remove the whip outright, or leave it as it is to hardly ever be used, I want to look at some potential features we can add to it that will still fit the Indiana Jones style flair while offering actual mechanical benefits in combat. My first suggestion is to add a trip attack to the whip. In 3rd edition, characters could attempt a trip action as an unarmed strike or by using certain weapons like the whip. In 5th edition, tripping a creature was largely replaced by the shove action, which allows you to push a creature either 5 feet away or knock them prone. But this streamlined the mechanic to be very dumbed down. What I really want to do here is give the whip the ability to trip enemies, emulating that rule of cool surrounding the weapon from films like Indiana Jones. To do this, I looked at the 1D&D weapon masteries, which give certain classes additional ways to use a weapon. While the whip in 1D&D was given the slow property, the mastery property topple perfectly encapsulates what I was thinking. It states, if you hit a creature with this weapon, you can force the creature to make a Constitution saving throw with a DC of 8 plus your proficiency bonus plus the ability modifier you use to make the attack roll. On a failed save, the creature has the prone condition. Combined with the enhanced reach of the whip, this gives it a greater utility roll on the battlefield, making it easier to run away from enemies or hit them with follow-up attacks. The main downside of this suggestion is that it once again steps on the toes of the Battlemaster fighter, who has the trip attack maneuver. However, the Battlemaster's maneuver uses a strength saving throw instead of Constitution, and it adds the superiority dice to the damage of the attack. So, even if this feature were added, the Battlemaster's trip attack maneuver would be better, but the whip would still provide this utility to characters who are not a fighter. My second suggestion on how to fix the whip is to give it a disarming attack. Also present in 3rd edition, the whip could be used to disarm an enemy, where characters could make an enemy drop their weapon or even steal it from them. Whips would get a +2 bonus to this disarm action, but in 5th edition, disarming is relegated to an optional rule in the back of the DMG, or as a maneuver restricted to Battlemaster fighters. By adding an innate disarming feature to the whip through a weapon property, players who use it will have the ability to remove a dangerous opponent's weapon, adding tactical depth to the choices we make on the battlefield. As I've discussed before, it seems that Wizards decided to take all of these fun martial options and just stick them on the fighter, as this suggestion does override the Battlemaster's disarming strike maneuver. However, disarming attack allows the fighter to add their superiority dice to the damage while using whatever weapon they prefer, whereas the whip's disarm maneuver would sacrifice a damaging attack to remove the enemy's weapon, and requires the use of the whip specifically. So, the Battlemaster maneuver would remain the better option, while adding an alternative for characters that want to disarm people but aren't playing a fighter. My third and final suggestion on how to fix the whip in D&D is to give it a melee reach of 15 feet instead of 10. Historically, longer bullwhips would only measure from 2 to 6 meters long, but they also weren't meant to be used as weapons per se. As such, the whip as a weapon in D&D requires us to suspend our disbelief just a little bit. In 3rd edition, the whip also had an expanded reach of 15 feet. An increase like this would put the whip's reach on par with my suggestion for the pike, but still only offer 1d4 slashing damage. In this way, the added reach would be what's making up for the lack of damage, and when combined with my first two suggestions, it makes the whip even better at controlling enemy movement and attacks on the battlefield. Just as with the pike's suggestion, I'd also recommend adding a negative to this to avoid making the whip too powerful, namely by adding a version of the lance's special ability which states that you have disadvantage when attacking an enemy within 5 feet of you with this weapon. With that negative in place, whip users would have greater control range, but they'd still have to use their movement wisely or risk being swarmed. Now, look, I understand that most of my suggestions are just to revert the whip back to how it was in 3rd edition. And I'm not going to pretend like I really dug into the depths of creativity to find these solutions. However, the old adage says it best: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The 3rd edition whip had everything a whip user could possibly want from an exotic weapon like this, and the fact that 5e's designers just tossed it into the weapon pool with all of these fun options stripped away is kind of mind-boggling to me. That being said, these are just a few of my own suggestions on how to fix the whip in D&D. If the whip is going to stay in the game, I think the biggest thing it needs to make up for its low damage is greater utility. I do like 1D&D's slow property that they're adding to it, as slowing down enemies with the whip might be just as useful as tripping or disarming them, but we'll have to wait and see how that feels once we get our hands on the 2024 books. In the meantime, we can use some or all of these suggestions to give the whip greater utility on the battlefield. With that, we come to the end of today's video on the whip. A weird wonder of a weapon, the whip is an incredibly creative weapon option in D&D, but doesn't really deliver on that wow factor once you start trying to use it. By tweaking the amount of utility it provides to offset its low damage, we can turn the whip into a dedicated control weapon, disarming and tripping enemies while your allies move in to finish them off. However, what I want to know is, what do you think of the whip? Do you think it's fine as is? Did you like some of the suggestions I put forward? Or did you have your own ideas on how to fix the whip in D&D? You can let me know down in the comments, or you can discuss it on the Altroll Discord using the link in the description. If you want to support Altroll, you can visit our Ko-fi to leave a one-time or recurring donation. And make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified when our videos go live. Now that we've done all the martial melee weapons, it's time to finish this series with the martial ranged weapons, starting with the blowgun next week. For now, that's all I had for you. Thank you all for watching, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.